Okay, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the different settings for type. So last video, I talked about type tool and how to get type into your document. So for this one, if you're following along, you're just going to open up a letter size document. You're going to take your type tool. You're just going to click one time. This is going to allow you to kind of just type. So I'm going to, because I just did a, oops, I'm the wrong tool. There we go, type tool. I just did a drawing of a narwhal, so I'm going to do that. And I'm also going to take this type tool and click and drag and create a paragraph just so you can see the different settings that you can use for the paragraph as well. I'm sorry, type box, text box, and then this is just the regular type tool. So just so you can see this bigger, I'm going to select it with the black arrow, hold shift and make it a little bit larger. And then I'm going to show you how to make some adjustments. So if you have the control panel, which is this panel up at the top here, open, you might see that you already have a couple settings that you can access really quickly. The same thing if you're in your properties panel, if you have text selected, you'll have kind of like the minimal options as far as your character panel. But what we're going to do is we're going to open up that character panel. So in order to do that, you might see it on your toolbar on the right here. It'll be a A. If you don't, you can go to Window and you can go down to where it says Type. And Type is the only one that has one of these arrows that kind of has extra panels like into a group kind of. And so you're going to select Character, which is also Command T. So that's a lot of different ways that you can get to that character panel. Once you open that character panel up, we're going to be talking about all the settings that are here. You're going to go to your fly down menu or your hamburger menu, and you're going to click on that and you're going to say show options if it's not already available to you. This when you have hide options, you only have these basic adjustments for you, and if you say show options, it gives you like kind of a whole nother extended panel of options that you have to mess around with your text. Okay, so the first option that you have in your character panel is your typeface. And there are lots and lots of different typefaces. I think when you first start using typefaces, you'll be like, gosh, why are there so many? And then as you get to kind of be more familiar with different typefaces, eventually you'll be like, there are never enough typefaces. So some of the options here are basically every computer and every program has its own licensing for fonts. And so the fonts that I might have on my computer might not be the same as the fonts that are on your computer. There are some public domain fonts, which means that everybody has access to them and you don't have to pay for them. There are fonts that people design that are hundreds of dollars to buy the whole font set. And then there's some where you can just make donations in order to use the font. There are amateur font designers who create fonts and put them on websites like dafont.com or Font Squirrel, and you can access those for free. And then if you have an Adobe account, you have licensing to a lot of different fonts. So you can actually click on the drop down for your font, and you can actually go to where it says Find More. And what that does is it will activate your Adobe fonts. Right now, I don't have access to that, I think because I'm not signed into my Adobe online, but basically it will take you to another website where you can activate those fonts and they will automatically show up in your Adobe. Another option is Google Fonts. So if I go to my web browser and I just create a new one and I say Google Fonts, whoops. You'll see that there are a lot of fonts. A lot of these fonts are designed, not what I wanted. Here we go. Okay, so we've got fonts.google.com. A lot of these fonts are designed for the web. Something to kind of be aware of is that fonts are designed specifically for the web, have a little bit more spacing because it makes it easier to read on a screen versus reading it in a book. That doesn't mean that you can't use those fonts kind of interchangeably, but just know that there are different fonts that are designed specifically for the web. So with these fonts, if you wanted to add a specific font that you might not already have on your computer, maybe you're looking for something like a script font. So you can go to where it says font properties. Let's see, categories probably. So they don't really have script listed, so we'll just look at handwriting. And so some of these, we could say, okay, Great Vibes. I want to download that font. So I click on this and I'm going to go where it says download family. Now we're going to talk about families in a second, but basically I'm going to click it. It's going to download a zip file. And whether you're on a Mac or a PC, that zip file, you have to open it up, and then you're going to see either a TTF or an OTF file in there, and you're going to double click on that, and it's going to ask you to install the font. This is the same for both a PC and a Mac. So you just click on install font. What it does is it installs it onto your computer. Just remember that name is Great Vibes. So if we go back here, we select our text and we go into our menu, and we scroll down to the letter G. So many fonts, Great Vibes, there it is. So automatically it comes into your program, okay? So there's lots of options out there for fonts. I have a couple of them linked in on Blackboard or Canvas. So here the next option is regular. Okay, so this particular font, this is your font style, and this particular font only has one option. So if you remember when I said about downloading the whole family, some of your fonts will be set so that it has different weights or thicknesses, has italic option. Because this is like a handwritten font, sort of, you don't have as many options, right? Because it already is slightly italic. Now, if you chose another font, like let's say a font that I know has lots of different options, like here, Avenir, see how it has this number in parentheses? That means it has 12 different options. So if I select that, I can go down here and I see light, light oblique, book, Roman, oblique, a medium. So each one of these gets a little bit thicker. And then they also have an oblique or italic option. Okay, so I can kind of scroll through and you can see my word changing as I go through to kind of show me what it is that's going to look like. So I'm just going to I'll choose light for now. And I'm going to zoom in on this. Okay, so the next the next option is your size. In this case, my font right now is 47.4. That's because I dragged it, so it's not going by single point increments. But I can hit that arrow to go up. I can hit the down arrow to get smaller. I can select from a variable sizes that are kind of like preset sizes that are common that Adobe has. Or I can just type it in. So like if I know that I want 120 point font, I just click in 120 and that gives me that, okay? I'm just going to go with 72 for right now. All right, I'm going to skip this leading option for right now. We're going to circle back to that. And then we've got this kerning. So kerning basically is the spacing between individual letters. If you look at this particular word, narwhal, you'll notice that the spacing between the N and the A and the R are pretty uniform. However, the spacing between the R and the W is really tight. Okay, and then the W and the H, again, is a little bit tighter than the other letters, and then you have more space in between that A and then the A and the L. Okay, so basically we would want to adjust this. Now, when I have a whole word selected and I try and adjust the kerning, you can see that I have only 3 options available: auto, optical, and metrics. Okay, optical, if we have like a large amount of text, we could probably hit optical. It'll do most of the work for us, and we can be happy. But if I was going to put this on signage or something really large, this is something that I want to pay attention to. So for instance, this, even though it's in the optical setting, there's still more space here and here than there is here. So in order to adjust that, I would have to put my cursor in between the R and the W, and then I have the ability to adjust the actual size. So I can kind of increase that a little bit until it looks right. Okay, so now I've got a little bit more space. I think what I want to do is I want to close up the space between this A and the R here, and between the N and the A, and between the H and the A and the A and the L. Okay, so the A is seeming to be the problem in this particular font. And every font is different. This isn't going to be the case for this word when I choose a different font. So it's something that you have to attend to kind of after you've chosen what font you want to use. And I'm going to attach some examples of bad kerning into my post, just so you can see some examples of why this matters. Basically, if you have two letters that go next to each other, sometimes those two letters can form a different letter, and then the word can say something that you don't want it to say. So be sure to make sure that your kerning is in good standing. Okay, so the next setting that we have after kerning is tracking. Basically, this increases the space between all of your letters uniformly. So unlike kerning, which focuses on in between two letters, this focuses on, I hit the wrong key. I meant to hit shift so that I could go by tens on my measurement. So this allows me to adjust the space between all those letters uniformly. I can either spread them out or I can squish them down and make it tighter. Okay. It's important to kind of like put into perspective that what you would want to do with this. So the reasons why you might want to increase the tracking. One, so that it takes up a certain amount of space if you wanted to take up more or less space. Two, maybe you want to put characters in between the letters. So if you think about the Friends logo and how it has the little circles in between each letter, that's an aesthetic choice. And three, you might want to spread letters apart just because, let's say you want it to be kind of like more modern, and let's say I even like delete this and put like a lowercase n in there. So let's say you're trying to do a heading for an article or something like that, and you just want to have like a modern kind of feel to it. Sometimes more space in between and lots of white space around gives you that feel. So that's another reason, an aesthetic choice, that you might want to have more spacing in between your letters. Okay. So those are the top settings. Those are the generic settings. Then you have some other settings. Down here, you've got your horizontal and vertical scale. What these do is they actually distort your typeface. So ideally, we don't really want to be doing that. Lots of designers put in a lot of time designing typefaces in a very specific way. They look at each individual part of every letter and how they fit together. And so it's important to like respect that. And we wouldn't really make changes to someone else's artwork in order to suit our needs unless we're kind of like using it in our own artwork and kind of destroying it completely. That's a different thing. That's kind of taking something and repurposing. But for this, if we're using these letters as they're meant to be used, then we ideally don't want to distort them. However, if you do end up with a distorted text, like let's say by accident I stretch this up, what I can do is I can go in here and type in 100% and 100%, and what that'll do is it'll make sure that my letters go back to their proportions. So you can use it as a correction as well. Okay, so the next option is your baseline shift. Basically, your text is on this baseline. That's what this little imaginary line is right on your text. And let's say I go back to having this letter capitalized. Let's say I want all of these letters to kind of line up at the top there. Now my H and my L already do, so I'm actually going to set, this is kind of crazy, but I'm going to go to view, and then I'm going to go to my rulers and show rulers, and I'm going to set a guide to kind of show me where the top of those letters are. Okay, so now you might notice that your H and your L actually line up a little bit higher, and that's like a visual thing so that your text looks all the same. But I'm going to highlight that ARW, and I want them to line up at that top line right there. So I'm going to shift the baseline. What that's going to do is it's going to move that text up to the top there. And this kind of looks funny, but that's okay. Maybe it's a design choice that I'm making. So actually, because I'm going to move this out of the way, and I'm just going to kind of apply that. So let's say I do want to have that setting. I'm going to take my image of my narwhal from over here, and I'm going to copy and paste that, because kind of that spacing almost exactly meets kind of my in my narwhal. So maybe this is the reason why you might want to do that, so that it kind of fits. Maybe I make it a little bit smaller. Okay, there's lots of different reasons, but what you'll notice is once I shift the baseline, that actual line that underlines those things when I have it selected is higher in that than in other ones. Another thing that I might want to do, and I don't actually particularly like this font with this, but let's say I have, I'm going to just create a line with my pen tool here, and I'm going to put a stroke on it, and I'm going to put the text on that. So I'm just going to type, oops, got to have my type on path selected, and I'm going to click here, and I'm just going to say narwhal. Now, all my text doesn't fit on there, so I'm going to just make it a little bit smaller, and I'm going to get rid of my tracking a little bit. Oops. Okay. So you can actually see already, because my baseline has been shifted from the last thing that I did, I'm going to put it back on 0. So when I have it on 0, the text actually sits on that line as my baseline. Now, if I increase the baseline, what it's doing is it's pulling the text away from that line. So what's cool about this is that if, so that line that we created actually disappeared, and there's no longer a stroke on it. However, if I did have a stroke on it, then I might actually want my text to be further away so that I can put a color on there, maybe go into here and change my profile. And so now, like, these two things are attached, and I can kind of adjust this per se, and it'll follow that path, but it's not on top of the path, because again, if I made this 0, what happens is that my text kind of goes right into my line and my stroke there, and I would want it to be a little bit further away so that I can make sure that I can read all the text. Okay, so that's another reason you might want to apply that baseline shift. The next thing is you have the option to rotate your letters. This rotates it as if it were in a box. So as it rotates it, it actually pushes those letters a little bit further away from one another. So again, this is where tracking comes in handy, because if you need to bring those letters closer together, you can use the tracking to do that in an easy way. But still have those letters rotated. You can rotate each letter individually as well, and kind of apply whatever settings you want. So I'm going to bring this back to 0. All right. The next thing is you can make everything all caps. So if you're messing around with a title and you're like, I'm not really sure if I want this to be all caps or if I want this to be lowercase, if you click on that button, that allows you to kind of flip back and forth between the two. The next button is what's called small caps. Now this is forced small caps. This actually is a pretty good example with this. There are fonts that are designed to be small caps, which means that the first letter is always a capitalized letter and the rest of them are also capitalized, but they're smaller. Okay, so actually, sorry, the letters that you might have capitalized are larger, but all your letters are capitalized, and the ones that are actually capitalized are just bigger. Okay, so this is forced cap. So what happens is you'll notice that the letter N and the letter A, R-W-H-A-L, are actually different thicknesses. Okay, so in a font that is actually designed to be small caps, you won't have that. The thickness will remain the same. This is a little awkward, and it's kind of frowned upon in the design world to kind of have forced all caps. Ideally, you would want to choose, forced small caps. You would want to choose a font that is designed that way so that the thickness is, what's the word I'm looking for? Consistent. That's the word I'm looking for. Okay. But that's the forced all caps. And then you have superscript and subscript for all those bibliographies that you need to write. An underline, which just like I showed you before with kind of typing on the path or if you're actually taking text and you're kind of better off creating your own underline. So that's what I would suggest, because you have so much more flexibility. You can make that a different color. You can change the size. You can change the profile width, and you can even mess around with brushes. Okay, and when you have just like the typical underline, that doesn't work as well. So maybe if you're going to underline a whole paragraph of text, you can use that typical underline. Otherwise, I would just create your own, especially in Illustrator. And then the last option you have is strike through. So basically that puts a line through each one of your texts. So, you know, that could be a design aesthetic that you want for something and a choice that you make. Okay, so that's all for the character panel. I'm going to briefly go through the paragraph panel, but before I do, I'm going to just take a note to this. We've got this text box down here, and I wanted you to have this because I wanted to show you what's called leading, okay? And that's in the character panel still. I have this text box selected. And if I increase the leading, what that does is it increases the space between lines of text. And so you have a little bit more space. Again, just like the tracking, it can be an aesthetic choice, specifically for like if you want something to feel airier and lighter and roomier, maybe more kind of like modern and artistic. If you give your space, more space to your lines of text, it can provide that. Also can help out with readability if you have something that's like really dense with a lot of body copy. If you increase the leading, it can kind of alleviate like some of the eye strain that it can cause. So if you remember when you were probably in high school and creating papers that you had to write, you probably always had to have it double spaced. That makes it easier to read. People can write in the margins, etc. And so the same thing kind of goes for your leading, except you have a little bit more control over how much space goes in between. It can be less than a double space. And the word leading is kind of a little funny because it looks like leading, so a lot of people mispronounce it. But where that term comes from is back in the day when they used printing presses to kind of create all of their papers and books and all that kind of stuff. Each letter had to be set individually. So those letters were either carved or cast, either out of metal or wood, and then in between those lines of text they would put pieces of lead, and that lead would be the spacing. And so when they would increase the lead, that would be increasing the leading. So a lot of the terminology that we use in these Adobe programs come from traditional methods of creating these things. And so when you're talking about text and you're talking about leading, that's where that comes from. So just a little history tidbit there. All right, so those are the settings for the character panel. The other options you have for your text is your paragraph panel. So that's not the only, you have lots of different options, but they're the only two that we're going to talk about today. So your paragraph, you should be familiar with a lot of these from just basically your word processing options. So here you can see that you can align your text to the left. You can have it centered, you can align it to the right, you can have it justified and aligned to the left, justified center, justified right, and then force justified, which means it's going to go all the way across your text box no matter what. You also have options here for like a left indent, first line of your paragraph, left indent, a right indent, space before a paragraph. So this is different than your leading. Means that every time you hit the return key, there's going to be space before the next paragraph. And then there's also space after a paragraph. So if you hit the return key, that spacing in between there. And then you also have this hyphenate option. I like to have this turned off because what happens is, especially if you have your own text and you're not really worried about lorem ipsum, sometimes it can break your words at really awkward and like inappropriate spaces. So it doesn't really know what words are on there. It just kind of breaks it wherever it needs to in order to kind of space out the text properly. So I always suggest turning this off. It's like this for all the programs. I would definitely turn off the hyphenate when you kind of start a document, especially if you're going to be working with a lot of text, just to get it off of there. You can always turn it back on for like specific paragraphs or anything like that, but you're better off hyphenating words where you want them to be hyphenated instead of the computer kind of doing the work for you and not always being on the mark. Okay, so that's it for your paragraph and your character settings. And next time we'll kind of talk about some more things. So hope this video helped you. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. All right, thanks.